Hello, today I am delighted to be joined by my guest, Eamonn O'Neal, a very familiar face to many of us here, particularly in the Northwest, where we've seen Eamonn on our TV screens for many years. Eamonn, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm delighted to be part of it. I'm a big fan of talking newspapers in general, and I had a bit of an insight to your talking newspaper when I was High Sheriff and visited both the Fed and the Nicky and others during both my years as High Sheriff.
It's certainly a great resource, and it's a good way to try and sort of help people stay connected. Talking of staying connected and communicating with people, you've enjoyed a very rich career in broadcasting. It's not sort of a natural career move for most of us, and certainly these days, I suppose, with the advent of mobile phones and everybody becoming an influencer and being able to broadcast their message to the world instantly. It's one of these things that's always fascinated me because I think that broadcasters in general, we become very familiar with them. They occupy a very special place in our hearts because you're almost like the background, that person that we can always rely on at the end of the day. And it engenders quite a bit of trust as well, doesn't it, Eamon?
Yeah, and a great example of that is the late Diane Oxbury. We might come to a bit further down the conversation. But my view is that, and this is a generalization, David, so you don't hold me to it, but essentially there are two types of broadcasters. One is someone who wants to be well known and a celebrity, and one who is a communicator and just enjoys, like yourself, talking to people, but more importantly, listening to people and prompting others to tell their stories. And I think that I hopefully fall into the category of being a communicator, a storyteller, a narrator, and a listener. And I get that from my parents, I think. But my career started as a teacher. Go back to A-level days. I thought I always wanted to be some sort of performer. I played in bands. I thought about acting. I did try to follow that career path unsuccessfully. And then I thought, well, my parents were teachers, so I went down the teaching route. But to kind of compromise, my main subject at college in Liverpool was drama. So obviously you did all the other stuff, the education stuff that you have to do, but drama was my passion. And then I taught in primary schools in Stockport, where of course you have a class all day and you have to be a jack of all trades. But drama was the thing that I enjoyed and used to draw out the talents of young children who would not necessarily be shining in the academic world. So, for example, in my final year as a deputy head at St. Winifred's in Stockport, we did a production of The Pirates of Penzance with the 10 and 11-year-olds. And I had a group of lads in my class who struggled with learning poems or writing stories. But you know what? If you give them a patch over one eye and a plastic sword, they learn all the songs
Yeah.
off by heart of the Pirates of Penzance. And it's about placing them in an environment that they don't realize they're learning, actually. And I found drama was like that. And then I developed a love for radio by being involved in Manchester Hospital Radio. Now, these days, virtually every hospital has its own radio station. In those days, there weren't that many. And Manchester Hospital Radio was a centralised one that went to 28 hospitals. And you started off by making the tea, the usual cliche stories. Yeah. And then you progressed to going around wards collecting dedications. And then, if somebody moved on or died, you got their programme if you were lucky enough. And I just fell in love with it. And so I was determined, this is while I was still teaching, but I was determined to try and make a go of a career in radio. And I suppose it sounds a bit pathetic now, David, but to try and get into BBC Radio Manchester, I tried everything. I sent, obviously, letters.
Yeah.
I sent a telegram. I sent a message in a bottle. I turned up and sang on the doorstep. I did all sorts of ridiculous things. And eventually, the manager thought, who is this guy? We better have him in and see what going
If
on.
we give you a job, will you leave us alone?
That's exactly right. Yeah, will you please stop? So what I did was then worked with the community programs, and there were programs for the Afro-Caribbean community in Greater Manchester, the Chinese, the Asian, the Jewish, and they created one for the Irish community, which of course, like yourself, like your community, the Irish community around here is significant.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm going back many years now. And that was my way in. And then eventually I decided I would need to, the hobby, it was a hobby and it got as far as it could go. So I needed to make a decision. And I decided to hand my notice in at school and go for it. And I left a very secure job in a big primary school as deputy head to go for a 10-week contract on very little money to BBC Radio Manchester as a community producer. But it's about passion, David. I didn't really have a plan. I didn't think, right, I'll do this for 6 months or 2 years, and then I'll move on to this, and then I'll move on to that. I've never really had a plan. I've had a series of interests and passions. Like I always wanted to work at Radio Manchester, and I managed to do that. Then I always wanted to work at Granada Television. That was tricky to get into, but I managed it. Then I always wanted to work for the Manchester Evening News, like the three big general organs of communication in Greater Manchester. And it wasn't a straightforward journey. It was a lot by accident. But I'm a great believer in when a door opens, if you're not going to go through it fully, at least peer around it and see what is on offer.
Pop your head in, have a go. Yeah,
exactly. Like you've done lots and lots of things in your life and career and your community work and so on. And if you stay at home and think, no, better not, you'll get nowhere.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting because I think, one of our previous guests was Andy Burnham, and we were talking about trying to engage young people in perhaps in politics and what would make them get involved to make their communities better. And I sometimes think it's just a general theme. We tend to assume that young people are sometimes disinterested in the more kind of traditional career paths. But I think what you've just said speaks to a lot of young people because that passion for communication and for perhaps for pursuing a path that is non-traditional, that's a bit to get to where you've got. That's something that they can still do today, isn't it?
Absolutely right. And I think, my own offspring, I've got Chris, whose stepson who's 50, Kieran, who's 33, and Laura, 31. And none of them has a proper job. If you want to describe an office job, for example, as a proper job. Chris is an actor. Kieran is an assistant director behind the scenes in drama. And Laura is a post-production producer, currently working in Vancouver. But they're all on freelance contracts, and it doesn't bother them. And I think more and more, the generation behind me is more used to and comfortable with a portfolio of interests, or not necessarily seeking something that I did at the beginning, 9 to 5, steady job, teaching, and so on. And I think actually, even the generation below them, COVID has made everybody think differently about how a job can be achieved, how a career can be planned. But I think that the bottom line is, if it's politics, or if it's broadcasting, or if it's education, or if it's housing, whatever it is, you've got to try and make the essence of it relevant to the lives that they're leading, because otherwise it's an academic, theoretical exercise. Politics, the word puts people off, but when you strip it out, it affects every aspect of our lives, especially the young ones. And this might be controversial. On that, I would lower the vote to 16, personally, because I think the older generations and many of, I don't know what the actual demographic statistics are, but I imagine there are more young people knocking about than there are old people at this point.
It's certainly interesting if you did lower that bar, whether or not you'd get more interest in it, I suppose, as well, because it becomes something that's attainable and something they can get. When you're younger, going back to what you were saying earlier about even the Pirates of Penzance, you're really, what I can see is the theme here is passion. If you are, and when we're younger, we've got more energy. We tend to have more passion for things as well. So I suppose that's the time to get involved, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think in politics, and again, I'm no expert on politics, but this is a generalization again, and just my thought. When you're in, I don't know how to describe it, middle-aged or older, and you're talking about the issues that are thrown up by our politics with a small p and a big P, we are tending to think about those issues in the moment. How will it affect me? Does it affect my pension? Does it affect my NHS, my GP? Does it affect X, Y, and Z as we are living in the moment? But if you give the opportunity for younger people to engage in a more meaningful way, and I think by giving the vote to 16-year-olds, that would help, they inevitably will be thinking, how does this decision affect my future? So they will, by default, be thinking about the future and how society might develop in that future because of politics. Whereas certainly I think, well, I don't know how much of a future I've got left in terms of years, but I've finished working full time. And I often think, my mother-in-law, God rest her soul, she's long dead now, but she said, I wouldn't want to bring a child up in this world. This is going back 30 years.
Yeah,
and you do wonder, her grandchildren are 13 and 10. You wonder what the world holds in store for them. But if you give them a voice earlier, they might be able to influence it.
It's really interesting you say that, because I think every generation, there's a sense of nostalgia for the sort of times gone by, and we think that the better generations have gone before us, and God bless them if my grandparents' generation and that whole generation, that pre-war, post-war generation, certainly some of the bravest people that you will have ever had the pleasure of meeting, and it tends to be that we sort of hold them in high regard for that reason. And we was almost inclined to write off the next generation as being more frivolous and perhaps living their lives with abandon. And certainly in this day and age, when you to paraphrase your mother-in-law's words, raising children in this climate, and certainly for you from a broadcasting point of view, we're in this sort of age where you've got a number of different things happening. We've got very volatile sort of global political figures in the background. We've got this advent of what they call fake news and different news channels that aren't necessarily the voice of trust or reason. There's been an awful lot in the press more recently about press bias and which way it goes. From your point of view as a broadcaster, it must be an immense responsibility.
It is. You've got to shoulder the responsibility, but I think in my own case, I think that we're in a world where the filters have started to disappear. The editing has gone in terms of things that are published. Everyone's a publisher. Everyone's an opinion former and so on. But in my own situation, apart from a stint at the end of the 90s down in London when I was executive producer of ITV's This Morning programme, apart from that, I have deliberately targeted the local media, regional media, BBC Radio Manchester, Granada Television, and the Manchester Evening News. And I did that because I wasn't interested in presenting news at 10. I wasn't interested in being invited into the jungle on I'm a Celebrity. What I was interested in...
I think you'd make a great contestant, by the way.
Well, my son Chris was in it. He was in the second series about 24 years ago. The one, well, it's many years ago, obviously won't remember it, but Phil Tufnell, the cricketer, won that particular series, so Chris was in that. But I think for me, it's about connecting with the communities in which I live and function. And so when I sit down behind a microphone, or when I used to stand in front of a camera at Granada, Radio Manchester Granada, or when I was writing or editing the Manchester Evening News, I always knew the audience because I am the audience, and my mum was, and our next door neighbour is. I'm sharing the news within the community that I inhabit. I'm not interested in me becoming the story, as it were. And sadly, with the advent of this proliferation social media and the things that you just mentioned, there's a lot of individuals who want to be the story. They're not sharing things that help us get on with our lives. And, you know, one of the greatest things of all when you're a broadcaster, for me, or a writer, you know, I was managing editor of the Manchester Evening News, but I also used to write a bit of a whimsical column on a Saturday. And I know this sounds cliche, but it's true. You know, you would be in the supermarket and someone would say, "Oh, I enjoyed your column. You know, I like that little joke at the end." Or, "Oh, I heard you yesterday talking to such a thing." Oh, you know. And then the more serious end, and Jimmy Wagg and I used to do Sunday morning programme for 32 years, which was, you know, had no preparation whatsoever. We sat down, two lads from Withenshaw, we just sat down and talked nonsense for 3 hours. But the number of people who contacted us in the olden days by letter,
yeah,
and latterly by email and text and so on. For example, Jimmy's got a son who's now 25, but obviously the listeners knew about him growing up. He has autism, and he has a severe form of autism. And we talked about Joe a lot, and Jimmy talked about him a lot with pride. There was no, oh, isn't it difficult for us? We were celebrating Joe's life. And the most moving thing we had was when we were leaving, when we were finishing that program, we had a letter from a guy who was in a similar situation to Jim, and he said, "You have got me through the last 15 years because you have normalized the situation. You've celebrated your achievements and Joe's achievements rather than look at the negative, and that has got me and my wife and my son through this." Now, that's very powerful. Another guy phoned us and said, "My dad just used to love listening to you on a Sunday. Sadly, he's just passed away in Buxton Hospital. And he was listening to one of your cassettes." That's how long ago it was. "Listening to one of your cassettes, and he died with a smile on his face." And we said, "Well, hang on a minute. We're not taking the blame for that." So on both sides, you have to remember, every time you open that microphone or stand in front of a camera, you are going to affect somebody or something you write in the newspaper. And you have to bear that in mind. And that's where the responsibility comes from. You know, I leave all the global news to people who enjoy doing that and broadcasting that. But for me, it's how you speak and what you write will affect somebody in one way or another. So you have to be very careful. Having said that, David, I always had a rule of thumb. I'll say it to anybody coming into broadcasting for the first time: don't get carried away. Because every time you come across someone who likes you, round the corner there'll be somebody who thinks you're rubbish. And don't get giddy when things are going well, and don't get depressed when things are a bit ropey, because it's somewhere in the middle always.
What I'm hearing from you there, Eamonn, is that there's a lot of authenticity, if you like. So rather than chasing sensationalism like the national press often do, local news tends to be a bit more authentic. But also, I'm also hearing, you know, you talked about your audience are people like you, the people like your mum and your family and so on. Am I right in saying that where we're from, our part of the world, our corner of the world, the Northwest, we tend to not stand for too much inauthentic nonsense. We like our news authentic, and certainly if you were broadcasting to your mum and you were telling fibs, you'd get a clip round the ear hole, I'm sure.
100%. That word that you've used, David, you've summed it all up in that one word: authentic. Authenticity is the most important thing of all. And I've always strived to be authentic, and so, which is a bit odd, because if you're striving for authenticity, I'm not sure you're authentic.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? But in everything I've done, teaching, broadcasting, interacting with people in various ways, I always, my mum's long dead now, but I always think, have I done that in a way that my mum would be proud? Or have I done that in a way that if she were here, she'd say, "Oh, dear, you could have done that better," or "You could have been more thoughtful," or, you know, whatever it is. And I think authentic is what it's about. Now, you know, if you talk about yourself being authentic, it sounds inauthentic. I am from a very grounded, big, extended Irish family, full of storytellers, full of what the Irish call the crack. We like to enjoy ourselves. No, I don't mean go out and enjoy ourselves. We celebrate each other. And I think the storytelling that I inherited from my mum, she was an infant teacher, reception class teacher, and a children's author as well, ultimately. And I think I and my siblings have inherited that. So we don't need to be told really how to engage with people, because we've done it all our lives.
Yeah.
And I think that when the worst thing that can happen is if you are listening to someone on radio, watching someone on telly, reading them in the paper, whatever it is, and you think they're all right, then you bump into them and they turn out to be rude or something else, disappointing in some way, that can really affect you. And so the best compliment anybody could pay me would be, I bumped into Eamonn O'Neal and he's just as you think he is.
Yeah, no, that's it. A lot of people say don't meet your heroes because you'll be disappointed. But I suppose if you are authentic and you're not trying to be somebody else, but you're trying to be the best version of yourself, somebody that would, as you said, I think make your mother proud. What more could you? What more
Well,
could you
I think it sounds a bit odd me talking about myself. It sounds as though I'm trying to convince myself I'm authentic. But the background that you come from, David, and the culture that you have been surrounded with is very similar to mine. Your Jewish upbringing, beliefs, sense of values, sense of family, sense of friendship is very similar to the Irish way of life. Our
Yeah,
religions are different, usually, not always. But we hold great store by looking after each other. And if you translate that into the job you're doing, whatever job it is, like your work with the housing association, you've got to be authentic. You've got to treat people the way your mother would be proud of. So whatever job you do, and that's all I've tried to do. Whether I've been successful or not is someone else's decision, really.
I should say so. I'm sure they'd be very proud. And so I really want to sort of talk about that because from relatively kind of almost humble beginnings, you have seen things in your life that I'm sure that you never thought would be on your horizons. You've enjoyed a fantastic career. You've taken us through quite a bit of it. Can you pick out some highlights for us in terms of the sort of things that for you really will forever stick in your mind as a cherished moment, if you like?
Yeah, I think in the early part of the career teaching, I think I alluded to earlier, if you can break through with a child or some children who would otherwise be set aside, there's nothing better than if you've helped someone in their early life. And a couple of examples that sound a bit naff, really, but there was a lad in my class. He was 10, and he just could not get fractions.
Yeah.
And I'm going back many years, of course, so I'm sure the teaching styles are very different to my style. Going back I qualified as a teacher in 1975, so I'm finished in 87, so that's the kind of time scale. And we were doing fractions. He just couldn't fathom it. Felt he was getting left behind, was getting frustrated and unhappy. And then it suddenly struck me that his dad was a milkman. And so instead of it being 1.3 plus 1.5, it was 1 pint of pasteurized milk plus 1 pint of sterilized milk. How much are you going to charge them? And he had it off like that.
Yeah.
And that's a very simple example of trying to, as we discussed earlier, make the world relevant. Another young lad was we would describe it now probably as dyslexic, but the labels weren't necessarily prolific in those days. I couldn't read a single thing that he wrote in his book in English, but what he wrote was amazing. So he created the most fascinating. He was 10. Created the most fascinating stories, but only he could read them because I couldn't make out his hieroglyphics. So he would read his own stories out in class rather than me read, mark it and all of that. And he went on to become an author, and that's because he had it in him. It was just myself and other teachers finding the key to unlock the gates to allow what he already had to flourish. So if you go back to teaching, it's that kind of, I know you've got teachers in your family and they would probably say something similar. In terms of radio programs, I think, they done a lot of serious stuff, but the Sunday morning program I mentioned that I did with my brother-in-law Jimmy for 30 odd years, we just made people laugh and we had a good time. And I like to think, and the evidence is there. Even last night I was at Manchester Cathedral for an event. Someone came up and said, "How's Jimmy? Oh, I wish you were still on. We used to have a real laugh on the Sunday morning, Brighton deal, etc." So it's that effect that you're having on people without realising. But there's a lot of, I got on a train once and I bought a book called Coleman Balls, which was a collection of broadcasters' mistakes that had been published in Private Eye.
Yeah.
It's still going now, but I don't think they call it Coleman Balls now. And I found myself, when I got to Crewe Station, got to page 26 or whatever, I was in it. And it turned out that, as I remembered it well, I was presenting a programme in the days when we had actual vinyl and you had to lean over and put a needle on the record. A guy called Tony Cole from the newsroom came in and said, "I've got a news flash about a rail strike." I said, "Okay, so here's Tony Cole from the newsroom. And what's the news, Tony?" And as he was saying that there was a 24-hour rail strike imminent, I was kind of not listening, leant over to put the next record on to cue that up, and then suddenly realised that he'd stopped talking. And so to fill the silence, I said, "Thank you, Tony. And how long is this 24-hour rail strike likely to last?" So there's millions of things like that. And, because of my approach to it all, I wasn't embarrassed. I didn't really care. It was a mistake. You move on because it's never about me. In terms of television, it's hard to pin any particular instance down. I've got a book here. I'm looking around on my bookshelves if I can just find it. It's called In the Parish of the Poor. And it was written by, I could have anticipated this question. It was written by the president of Haiti. And this is going back into the 80s when I was presenting an arts programme from Liverpool, from Albert Dock. And he's called, heck of a story this, isn't it? Jean-Paul Aristide, I think he's called. Aristide is his name anyway.
Yeah.
And he was an ordained priest, but he'd become president of Haiti. And Haiti, as we know, has been a place of conflict for many, many, many years. And we had a bit of difficulty with the interview because his English wasn't great. However, an opportunity to meet someone who was the president of a conflicted island, the other side of the world, was a real privilege. And you meet people who you wouldn't normally meet. Nice people, people who, as I said earlier, would disappoint you. I'm not going to name names here, but there were a couple of people who I thought were great, and when they came in to be interviewed, weren't great. But I tell you how you find that out, David. It's not how they are with me as an interviewer. I went through a period when I was executive producer of regional programs. I was head of regional programs and presenting. So I was my own boss in that respect. Now, when you get famous people who come in to be interviewed, they're usually pretty nice or compliant with the boss or with the presenter. And how you test their mettle is how they are with the runner or the person who they're going to bring
behind the scenes,
or the people who they don't necessarily think are important. And that's how I always judged everybody. And one of the people who impressed me the most wasn't a politician, wasn't anybody serious. It was Donny Osmond.
All right.
Donny Osmond came to be interviewed by us on a horrible, wet, pouring down cold day at the Old Granada Studios on Key Street. And word had got out, so there was loads and loads of people at Car Park Lodge waiting to have their people of a certain age waiting to have their albums signed because they had him on their walls. They had his picture on the walls.
Yeah.
And he, on the way in, he stopped, he got out of the car, he signed everybody's photographs and albums. He came in, he was delightful. He was an ideal guest. And by the time he left, another crowd had gathered, and he did exactly the same. He stood in the rain, and he didn't go until everybody had had the photograph taken, had everything signed. It was lovely. And then the other side of the coin is another star of a similar ilk was driven in with darkened windows and refused to stop or talk. And then his people came to me and said, he's not going to sign anything, so don't ask him. As it turned out, my mum had given me an LP from one of her friends and had asked me to get it signed. And I was deliberately told he wouldn't sign anything. But of course, David, the programme was live. So during the live interview, I actually said, he was called David as well, actually. David, I know that you're not prepared to sign autographs or albums or photographs, but I do have one here. I'm sure he would sign it for me. So he had no choice. So I kind of got the message across. I got my mum's friend's album signed, and off he went. So I'm kind of dancing around because I can't really think of any specific things. But you do get some privileges. And to be serious for a moment, you know, the opportunity to broadcast, for example, the day after the arena bombing was a real privilege. And there's nothing trivial about that, clearly. That takes a different style of broadcasting. It takes some research. It takes a level of integrity that you wouldn't do in a frivolous Sunday morning programme, obviously. And that morning was a really interesting morning because Jimmy Wagg and I presented the programme the morning after, so the after shock, if you like. And we were chosen to do it because we were two authentic Manchester broadcasters. We weren't trying to get in on the act, if you see what I mean. And also that morning, then I contributed to RTE in Dublin and Radio Scotland and a couple of other national broadcasters because we know Manchester. You know, we were part of the community that were affected. And on the way home, then the reflection is such a privilege to have played a very small part in that huge Manchester story. And I'll tell you that, you know, the Manchester Evening News are really, really excellent at this. And that atrocity recently at the synagogue, you know, the local radio, the local television, the local papers really come into their own and put their arm around the community. And to be able to have done that over my career has been a real privilege.
We're very grateful for it as well because it's those familiar voices. You know, we talked at the beginning about the element of trust that we have with those familiar faces, but we rely on you to sort of give it to us straight, to comfort us in our times where we feel that we're alone, and you sort of have this way of knitting everybody together because we do feel that we're kindred spirits, that we're all part of the same wider family, and you know, I think that's a remarkable thing, and it's a remarkable privilege and responsibility that broadcasters get to have. And I'm not sure if modern broadcasters understand that the scale of that responsibility sometimes.
I think you're right. I think, you know, if you're watching national news, and this again generalizing because every individual is different, watching breakfast television or national news, you know, they're going from one item to the next. They're putting politicians to the sword. They're reading auto cue, and then they move on, and that's the nature of it. But when you're local or regional, you feel it. You know, you're talking to well, not yourself. You're talking to people like you. I mean, going back to that trust, I mentioned Diane Oxbury right at the very beginning. I worked with Diane Oxbury on radio and television for many years. Sadly, she died just over 6 years ago of ovarian cancer, and it was one day, less than 1 month from being diagnosed to dying. It was terrible. And on the back of that, we set up the Diane Oxbury Trust very quickly to raise awareness of the symptoms and the dangers of not getting diagnosed quickly. But Diane, you'll remember, she did lots of broadcasting, but she was well known for being the weather presenter at the end of Northwest Tonight every day. And even now, 6 years on, I meet people who love her, who think they knew her. They may never have met her, but she was that trusted, wonderful bright, funny, clever, attractive, warm, authentic person that finished off that program every evening. And she was in everybody's living room every day of the week, and people loved her. And when we launched the charity, we were inundated with donations, obviously from people who knew her, but predominantly from people who knew her from the television.
Yeah.
Never met her, most of them, and they were very, very, very generous. And Diane was the embodiment of that person in your living room every day that you can absolutely put your trust in.
Oh, it's great to be able to remember her in that way, and it's a great legacy to have, isn't it, Eamon?
It was a bit naughty as well, you know. She had a wicked sense of humour and didn't suffer fools gladly, but we did have some. She and I were in North Wales once, about to do a programme, and before we did, we went into a restaurant, and we were in that place with a very long name, you know, I can't say it, Clanfair, Pwllgwyn, and we were in this restaurant, and she said to the guy, the waiter, would you mind saying very, very slowly where we are? And he said, Burger King. And she told that story time and time again. It was a lovely moment.
That's lovely. I'm really mindful of your time. I could talk to you forever, and I know that you've got a lifetime of stories that you could tell as well. Just very briefly before we go, and I'm almost sorry to cram this into the last few minutes, but you play a different role as well beyond broadcasting. You mentioned when we first met that your role as High Sheriff. It's something that sounds like it belongs in the Book of Legends
Yeah, it does. It sounds like Robin Hood, doesn't
it? Robin Hood. But what does it entail really for people that don't know? Yes, we see you sometimes dressed up in your ceremonial outfit with the medals and so on, but what does it really mean to you?
So, and don't worry about rushing off. We can extend the chat if we need to. So the role of High Sheriff goes back more than 1,000 years. It's the oldest secular royal appointment. It's mentioned in the Magna Carta 23 times or 19 times out of the 23 clauses or something like that. And it was a role that was created all those years ago to be the most powerful person in the Shire, what we call counties now. So the word sheriff comes from Shire, Reeve being the boss, if you like. So the High Sheriff, or the Sheriff as it was just then, had ultimate powers. They were judge and jury, they were law and order, they could raise the posse, they raise an army, they did everything. And one of the other most important things they had to do on behalf of the king, the monarch, was to collect taxes. And they collected the taxes in their own shire, in their own county, and sent it down to the king. And there were quite a few rogue sheriffs, because what happened here is if you didn't collect enough taxes, it was taken, the shortfall was taken by the monarch from your own wealth. So a lot of them were really cruel and ruthless. And also, I think, probably pocketing quite a bit of the taxes.
Yeah.
So at some point then, the Lord Lieutenant role was created to keep the High Sheriffs in check. So we still have Lord Lieutenants now. They're appointed by the monarch for a period of time up until the 75. The current High Sheriffs are appointed by the monarch for 12 months. So usually April to April. And the ceremonial, really, there are absolutely no powers attached to it. There's, incidentally, David, there's no stipend or wages attached to it or expenses either. So every single thing from stamps to swords, transport to entertaining comes out of your own pocket. So you do it for the good of the communities.
Do they give you a slightly better table at Burger King,
Eamon? Yeah, they do. Yeah, they do. And talking about authentic, when I was at a cathedral for a ceremony, all dressed up in my uniform with my sword and everything, this guy came up to me and said, "Oh, it's all right for you. I'm having to get the train home. You're probably waiting for your driver, aren't you?" I said, "I am actually. Yeah, it looks as though he's here now." And he said, "That's an Uber." I said, "No, that's what I'm getting in." Another time, Sheila and I, my wife, the Sheriffina, we were paying a visit to a place in Failsworth, and we were standing at the door after having finished the visit, and it was pouring down. And this very posh lady said to Sheila, "Oh, don't go out in this. Wait here in the dry until your driver arrives." And Sheila said, "My driver's already here." "Oh, really? Where?" He said, "They're standing next to you, because I used to drive myself. I'm accepted to town."
Yeah.
We did it our way. Anyway, because we're in the Duchy of Lancaster, the old Duchy of Lancaster is now Greater Manchester, Lancashire, and Merseyside. Merseyside and Greater Manchester, obviously, two metropolitan counties that were created in 1974. And because the monarch is the Duke of Lancaster, the way we are chosen as High Sheriffs is very different to the rest of the country. So if you could be bothered and you're interested enough, you could go online now, David, and check who's going to be next year's High Sheriff and the one after in all the counties of England, apart from the Duchy of Lancaster, because that's kept secret until the pricking of the lighties.
Oh.
Yeah, so you get pricked. The lighties refers to a piece of vellum on which three names are printed, and the monarch will use a bodkin, first used by Elizabeth I, hatpin, to prick the name of the person he wants to be High Sheriff. So in the counties of Merseyside, Greater Manchester and Lancashire, that happens in March and it's kept secret until then. Obviously you know in advance because you've got to prepare, but you're supposed to keep it secret. And the reason he pricks it with a hat pin is to avoid any confusion. So if you just said, "I'll have David Mintz," by the time that message got from London back up to Greater Manchester on a horse,
Yeah,
various horses, whoever was sending the message either got it wrong or could change. So we are pricked by the monarch in March, and then you do it for 12 months. And the three main roles when you are High Sheriff is to uphold the integrity of the Crown, to look after the welfare of the visiting High Court judges as they come through. And the third one is the most important, or it was to me anyway, was to identify, celebrate, and in my case, amplify the great work that is being done by communities across your patch, and to say thank you. It doesn't, High Sheriff, you spend all year, to be honest, David, explaining what a High Sheriff is, because no one really. But it's an opportunity for someone who has been appointed by the King or Queen, for me, first time round, to come to your organisation.
You've been appointed by, you're unique almost, in that due to the way that it fell, you've been appointed by two separate monarchs.
Yeah, 2020 by Her Majesty the Queen. And then, of course, by the time we did it again last year, the King was the monarch. So that is unusual and unique. And so, for example, when I went as High Sheriff to the Nicky and to the Fed, by the way, Mark Addleston from the Fed, former chairman, now patron, he was the High Sheriff.
He was
the year preceding me in 2020. So, but when you go to these places, or to the League of Jewish Women, I've been to many organisations and events, just really to say thank you, because without the volunteers and without the community working together, the world would come to a standstill. So it's a very great honour. It's ceremonial. It costs you money to do it. But you were saying before about broadcasters meeting people. You do get to meet some fascinating people, and entertaining the judges or looking after the welfare of the judges is a kind of a nod to the past. But if you might have a dinner for them, and they're all fascinating people. Oh, and you also get a portrait, but it's a photograph, not a painting, held in the corridors of the Crown Court in Manchester, and I'm the only one with two. One sitting down, one standing up.
That's enough to scare anybody straight in the Crown Court.
I've had a message from a friend called Patrick the other day. He said, "I'm on jury service and I've had to walk down that corridor and I've got a shock because there you are with your sword twice."
Eamonn, thank you so much for your time. Before I let you go, going to throw you one last question, which is possibly a little bit harder. If you could pick one thing, we've spoken about sort of the younger generation, but if you could pick one thing that life has taught you that you think is always stands you in good stead and you could pass on to people that are listening to this, what would it be?
That friendship and kindness are everything. Kindness is the most important thing of all. Just be kind. And in that, that whole kindness encompasses lots of things. Smile at people, say thank you, be nice. But kindness, I think, my mum was always very kind. In fact, when I was high chef, I was trying to come up with a motto, like, because I thought you had to have a Latin motto. I couldn't really come up with any good Latin phrases, so I just asked. My motto, if you like, was kindness and friendship are everything. And I would encourage everybody just to spend a couple of minutes thinking about that.
Can't go wrong with that. Eamonn O'Neal, absolute pleasure to meet you. I can actually say you should meet your heroes because Eamonn O'Neal is exactly as he seems on the screen. So thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today and to talk to our listeners as well.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure, and I hope your listeners have enjoyed the ramble. I do ramble. I talk a lot, but I suppose that's part of the job.
It's good. It's good. We'll get you back for part two.
Let's do part two, David. Let's book it in. Yeah, great. Keep up the great work.
Thank you.